Ukraine's foreign minister visits Beijing for talks, the first trip by a Ukrainian government representative to China since Russia's invasion more than 2 years ago. Beijing intensifying diplomatic efforts, but why now? Can they help end the war? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. Now, Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba has been in Beijing. It's the first time China has hosted a senior figure in the Ukrainian government since Russia's invasion in 2022. It's the biggest conflict in Europe since World War II, a war which has killed and injured hundreds of thousands of people on both sides. Major arms supplies and funding from NATO and EU countries have helped Ukraine fight Russia. And Moscow, for its part, well, it's placed its economy on a war footing. Despite fears of a nuclear World War III, diplomacy seems to have taken a back seat. What can we make of the latest diplomatic moves, then, centering on China? Could they broker an end to the war? Why is it all happening now? We'll discuss all of that with our guests in a few moments. But first, this report from Sharif.
Fierce fighting on the front lines, while military analysts say the war has reached a stalemate. But there are signs of movement on the diplomatic front, with China playing a significant role. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba has visited Beijing, hoping dialogue will help where fighting has so far failed. Ukraine wants to recapture territory Russia has seized since 2014, more so since its full invasion 2.5 years ago.
China has reaffirmed its respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. This is very important. My Chinese colleague clearly said he agrees that we need not the illusion of peace, but a just and sustainable peace. This is what we should strive for. We should not be seeking temporary solutions.
As a precondition for any peace talks or a ceasefire, Russian President Vladimir Putin wants Kyiv to surrender the 4 regions Russia partly occupies. The last major negotiations between the two sides was in Istanbul more than 2 years ago. President Volodymyr Zelensky has rejected any possible agreements based on Putin's demands. But Kuleba's visit to China reflects some momentum in diplomatic activity. And Moscow says it's open to discussions about ending the war.
Russia in general is open to the negotiation process. But first, we need to understand how ready the Ukrainian side is for this, and if the Ukrainian side has permission for this form of curators, because very different statements have been made.
China has presented itself as a neutral party, but it remains one of Russia's biggest political and economic allies, helping to weaken the impact of sanctions.
China did not create the Ukraine crisis, nor is it a party to it. China has not provided lethal weapons to either side in the conflict, and did not and will not profit from it. China's position on the Ukraine issue has been consistent and clear. It is too urgent to promote peace through a political settlement.
A peace summit in Switzerland last month aimed at ending the war made little progress. Russia wasn't invited, China didn't attend, and several major nations in the global south, including Brazil, India, Mexico and South Africa, refused to sign the communiqué. The US, EU and NATO have provided Ukraine with extensive military and financial support, the most for any one country in modern history. But it's another battle far away that may be behind the renewed diplomatic push: the US presidential election. Republican candidate Donald Trump is opposed to sending military aid to Ukraine and has promised to end the war if he wins in November. The end of US support, if it were to happen, would dramatically alter the balance of war and not in Ukraine's favor. Sharif, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring our guests into the show now. We have joining us from Beijing, Einar Tangen, a political and economic affairs specialist and senior fellow at the Taihe Institute. In Moscow, Chris Weafer, the CEO of Macro-Advisory, a strategic consultancy focused on Russia and Eurasia. And in Rome, Owen Matthews, a contributing writer for the Spectator magazine and author of Overreach, the inside story of Putin's war against Ukraine. Thanks for all of you joining us. Let me start with Owen in Rome. So should we read the Ukrainian foreign minister's recent visit to China as a sign that Ukraine is now trying to focus more on diplomacy as a solution to the war?
Well, I think, unfortunately, the reality on the ground is that they have increasingly little choice but to seek an end to the war because, tragically, the one thing that Ukraine is running out of is the one thing that the West cannot help them with, and that is man and women power on the front lines. Ukraine is experiencing an acute shortage of fighting forces, to the extent that actually they haven't even given the forces that are fighting a break in more than 2 years of conflict. The other issue is that the policy of continuing the war forever or until victory, until they regain the borders, is increasingly not working in their favor, in the Ukrainians' favor, because they are steadily, not dramatically, but steadily losing ground bit by bit to the Russian steamroller. And the third issue is that the Russian strategy of destroying Ukrainian electricity infrastructure in particular is going to be devastatingly telling this winter.
But Owen, what do you make of the Ukrainian counter-argument that they have been able to stabilize the front lines more or less? They're not losing territory, at least at the pace that they were earlier this year.
Well, that's correct. They're losing it less quickly, but nonetheless, they're still losing it. And the real issue is that the attacks on the electricity infrastructure are actually going to make major cities, particularly Kharkiv, the second city of Ukraine, virtually uninhabitable this winter. That tactic of attacking energy infrastructure has actually been fiendishly effective, I'm sorry to say.
All right. So the situation on the ground getting more and more complicated, perhaps. Chris, how much diplomatic clout and leverage does China have in the conflict, particularly over Russia, if that's where it seems Ukraine is now looking?
China has the greatest leverage over Moscow of any other country, because as we know, that the trade between Russia and China has been very substantial, well over 200, maybe $240 billion. This year, the fact that the Chinese have been willing to buy so much Russian goods and supply Russia with a lot of the goods that it cannot get from the West. For example, the streets are full of Chinese cars and other products. That's helped stabilize the economy and accounted for the government's relatively strong financial position. So the Chinese do absolutely have the greatest say. And if China up to now has I suppose stood aside to some extent, if they were to take a greater role, a more forceful role, and started pushing for peace, it would make a difference.
Do you think they want to, Chris?
Yeah, I think so. It's obviously it's gone on for 2.5 years. Without a peaceful solution, it doesn't look like there's going to be a military victory. It'll just keep going on. And the longer it goes on, the more problems it's creating for the Chinese themselves. So, for example, the most damaging sort of sanction that Russia and its trade partners are now dealing with is the US Treasury threat of secondary sanctions against banks dealing with Russia in sanctioned areas. Now, that's led to a lot of difficulties in cross-border payments. It means that Russians are finding it more difficult to pay for goods and import goods from China, and China and India are having difficulties in actually paying for the oil. So there's starting to be a secondary effect, a negative effect on the Chinese economy. And I think for all these reasons, essentially they've decided it's time to draw a line on this.
All right, let's take it to Beijing. Einar, is China mediating? In fact, has Beijing been mediating for a while, if you believe some of the reports, if not for a complete end to the war and a sort of deal to end everything, at least to try and build some common understanding, some basis for the future of talks?
Well, I'm going to disagree with my colleague. Beijing is not the United States, Washington. This idea that you go in and settle things by pushing your weight around hasn't worked. Otherwise, the U.S. would have already settled things. Quite frankly, from Beijing's point of view, what they can do is set the table, and then the people have to sit down. There's no way they're going to force Vladimir Putin to accept some deal that he doesn't want. So I would strongly disagree with my counterpart in Russia. What they have done is, since the very beginning, this is, after all, the fourth round of shuttle diplomacy that they've been engaged in, is they're trying to get them to come to the table, to realize this is never going to be won on the battlefield, despite all the EU and US protestations that, victory is just a few bombs away. The only people who really...
China does have a lot of leverage here, right? Given its trade relationship with Russia.
But it doesn't use that kind of leverage. It can't use that kind of leverage. It also has a relationship with Russia. And right now, there's nothing that the U.S. would like more than to put a wedge between Moscow and Beijing. The combination of Russian resources and Chinese manufacturing is unparalleled, and it eclipses the United States. This is a visceral threat seen in Washington. They're trying to figure out how they can pull these two apart. It is a three-cornered game, just like it was during the Cold War.
Interesting. Chris, can there be a final resolution? Okay, I'll let you, I think you wanted to come back in, but my question to you is going to be, can there be a final resolution without one side basically admitting defeat to some degree to the other?
If I could just very quickly, but to clarify, I don't disagree. Our position is not too different with my colleague from Beijing. We're certainly not looking at a situation where China would look to dictate terms, which would tell Vladimir Putin, you have to do this whether you like it or not. No, what I need to say is that China is looking perhaps to create the conditions for a peace process where people come together, but to have to obviously come up with a solution that suits them. So I do not, in any sense, believe that China would force it. So we agree there, but China clearly will have the instrumental role in bringing people together. But in terms of the peace, well, see, this is where the difficulty is. We now have a situation where, as we've heard, officials in Kiev are talking about the need for peace talks, or indicating it, and we hear from Moscow their willingness to sit down and also move to peace talks. But the position from both sides is very, very far apart. Moscow says it wants control over the four territories, and it wants Ukraine neutrality, not to join NATO. Ukraine, in the other part, says it does not want to give any territory. There's some suggestion perhaps they might concede Russian control over Crimea, but not over the four provinces in the east. So we are starting, even if the peace talks were to start tomorrow, it's both sides are very, very far apart in terms of the conditions that they say they need for those peace talks.
So it sounds like both sides haven't really backed down there that much on their sort of conditions for talks. Owen, in Rome, we heard about a week ago. Sorry, did you want to come back in there? I'll let you have a brief comeback, very briefly, Einar.
2014 is when this started. From the Russian point, the U.S. backed a putsch, and they put in their own government. There were two peace plans that were put forward, but it was revealed later. But both the Germans and the French had no intention of following it through. That would have left Ukraine intact, independent states. So this idea that there wasn't a path before, and that suddenly everyone's being very stubborn, I don't agree with.
All right. There was a chance. Let me take this point then to Owen in Rome. About a week ago, there may have been a path before, as Einar's pointing out. Where is that path looking now? Because about a week ago, we heard the Ukrainian president speak about ending the hot stage of the war by the end of the year, and how not all territory needs to be won back by force. Is the Ukrainian position softening a little bit here?
Let's be very clear about what kind of endgame is feasible in this war. Now, I think we can argue that Putin very much wants some kind of strategic carve-up involving Washington and Beijing, which will establish some sphere of influence. That's what he wants, but he's not going to get it. The way this war will end is it will be a ceasefire, an armistice. Because from the Ukrainian point of view, the idea of surrendering land for peace, in other words, formally ceding territory, is completely inconceivable. Ukraine will become ungovernable overnight. There is a huge constituency of people who have fought and bled and died and who are very nationalistic, who will immediately topple any government and will refuse to cease fighting over
so,
that
Owen,
kind of formal...
you mean a kind of Cyprus or Korea scenario where the conflict is frozen, if not completely resolved?
A frozen conflict, a ceasefire along a line of control. That is what we're talking about. We're not talking about a deal where Ukraine concedes any territory. That is domestically, politically inconceivable in Kiev. However, as you rightly mentioned, there have been examples in diplomatic history, specifically, as you rightly say, Cyprus was divided in 1974. The Greek side of Cyprus does not acknowledge that partition, but nonetheless joined the EU, was already in NATO. They managed to have half a century of peace. North Korea as well, and South Korea also never acknowledged that line of control. Nonetheless, they got on with their lives. So it's very important to actually see that the kind of vector towards which we're going with these talks is not some kind of Yalta-style carve-up, such as the one that ended the World War II in 1945. It's going to be a ceasefire. And that is really the crucial point about this, about these negotiations.
Chris, what about the Russian position? Are they also thinking along those lines of maybe a sort of frozen conflict? We heard recently Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov welcoming the Ukrainian foreign minister's comments about Ukraine's readiness for negotiations with Russia, saying, hey, that's in line with what Moscow's position always was.
We have to separate what we hear officially from the Kremlin and what we're hearing privately or what's being discussed perhaps off air. So the official position is that Russia wants control over the territories and it wants Ukrainian neutrality. But privately, as Owen has mentioned, this word armistice has been mentioned a lot, and it continues to be mentioned. And references to, Cyprus, North Korea, Kashmir, and other places are more frequently heard. So it seems to me that while the Russians will start at the table saying they want control, I believe that in the end, they're probably thinking along the lines of an armistice, provided they can get something in return, which essentially means the starting of the unraveling of some of the key sanctions. If they get that, then I think armistice is definitely the way to go.
Einar, do you see that's where diplomacy, particularly diplomacy by Beijing, is focused on right now? As our guests have been saying, we've got to make a differentiation between what's said in private and what's said in public.
Yeah, once again, I have to make this distinction between the way that Washington operates, which is what we're used to, and the way that Beijing operates. They've shown that the way they operate is just bring people to the table and not try to impose their agenda on it. In terms of Russia and Ukraine, the problem is still there. I disagree that an armistice by itself and a few sanctions are going to solve this. This was always about security. Russia felt that the promises made to them that there would not be an expansion of NATO into Soviet bloc countries should be honored. The fact that it was not honored and it was approaching Ukraine, everybody knew if you went into Ukraine, the Russians would fight you. And that wasn't, hypothetical. It was absolute. And the greatest statesman of the U.S. said that. So right now, it would have to also include something that says that Ukraine is neutral, that they do not join NATO, and do not position missiles in their country aimed at Moscow. Remember, it's only 5 minutes away from the border to Moscow, and that as we know, there's a lot more room between Cuba and Washington, and we were prepared to go to nuclear war back then.
Okay. Do you see, Owen, that is actually what Ukraine's thinking right now in the diplomatic push that is going on that they're thinking along those lines to make those sorts of concessions on security? I mean, because what we're hearing, or we're seeing publicly, Ukraine talking about another peace conference after the Switzerland gathering, preparing for a vote in the General Assembly on food, security, energy, and so on. Is Ukraine focused on making concessions on security or rallying the world around its entrenched position?
Well, before I answer that, let me just pick up on something that Einar said. It's a complete myth that has been comprehensively debunked by scholars, including Mary-Elise Sarraute, who spent 15 years and got all the documents, that NATO or the West or the United States formally promised not to expand NATO. That literally never happened. It's been completely comprehensively proven that that NATO did not promise, or the America did not promise not to expand NATO. But to answer your question, the Ukrainians were already willing.
All right, hang on, Einar. I'll give you a chance in a second. Go ahead, finish the thought, Owen, then we'll give Einar a chance to come back in.
Historical discussions are by the by. The point is that right now we have a situation where already at the beginning of talks in Antalya and in Istanbul, it's pretty clear, and I've spoken to several of the participants who were literally at that table on the Ukrainian side, that the Ukrainians were willing to concede a form of neutrality right at the beginning of the war. Now, that was probably a deal that that Russia should have taken, by the way, because what was on the table was basically parking the issue of the status of Ukraine, having a Russian withdrawal to the borders before the full-scale invasion of 2022, and crucially, Ukrainian neutrality. Ukraine was, in fact, formally neutral between 2010 and 2015, constitutionally so. They changed it back. And the issue of Ukraine's NATO membership is
Russia
the
that didn't want to go for a deal? I mean, something along those lines has been reportedly proposed in different venues, the Istanbul talks. Russia...
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
I mean, also there are claims from the other side that it was the Ukrainians who didn't want to go for it because they were promised a lot of weapons in the last minute, or so the narrative goes. Anyway, I'll give you a brief opportunity. Okay, all right. Let Einar come back in. A brief one, Einar, before we move on.
Yeah, Owen, I disagree with you. I've read Howard Baker's memo that was sent to the leader of Russia. It's very clear. It was not in writing. I'm a lawyer. I understand that. But this idea that the Russians never thought that NATO was going to continue or that it was going to expand into those areas. So this idea that somehow, because we didn't promise it, you don't have to, we can do whatever we want, kind of childish.
All right. You know what? I think we'll leave. Let's go ahead. But let's make a quick point. But let's leave the history for the historians. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah. No, I wasn't going to do history. My quick point basically is that just to reinforce the fact that this is all about Ukraine, the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. The fact is that NATO have had a border with Russia via the Baltics for decades, and Finland has joined NATO, and Moscow complained a bit but hardly blinked. So Ukraine is and always has been a very different situation and separate from NATO.
I want to go back to Owen in Rome. Let's shift gears a little bit, Owen, and talk about why now. I think one thing we can all agree on is there has been some kind of uptick in diplomatic activity. Is this to do with the US elections being close and perhaps some, particularly in Kiev, wondering about where that might leave them?
Certainly. But I think the US elections are not necessarily as relevant as one might imagine. I think the last major US aid package was the last major US aid package. That was delayed by 6 months. It went through enormous political ructions to get that passed, even with a Democratic president in the White House. There is, I think, not going to be another $60 billion aid package for the very simple reason that actually I think there's a law of diminishing returns on these. I mean, the first $60 billion package was supposed to fund the great breakthrough of 2023. Never happened. Second one, there was no great breakthrough. Ukraine in this summer, they continue to lose. So actually, the significance
and the delay,
of the US
we should
elections,
say, a 2-month delay in that European aid package of 50 billion euros.
Oh, yeah.
Right? as well.
Yeah, sure, but actually, that was not military aid package. That was more civilian aid package. But indeed, no, the significance of the U.S. elections is because Vladimir Putin thinks that it's going to be a game changer, and there is no conceivable reason for Putin to end this war before he knows the result of the November election, because he thinks that he could get a better deal out of Trump. Now, I actually personally think that the deal that Trump will end up doing if he's president, or Harris will end up doing if she becomes president, is the same deal. It will be partition of Ukraine de facto, not de jure, along the line of control, plus security guarantees for Ukraine, short of full membership, but very importantly, mirrored by security guarantees from the Chinese side for the Russians. That's how it's going to go down.
All right,
and
Einar.
And there's not going to be support for a forever war, even among the very strongly pro-Ukrainian Democrats in the US.
Got it. All right, Einar, one imagines those kinds of calculations are something that Beijing is keeping in its mind as it tries to navigate this one?
Well, let's see how Beijing is navigating. They're going to global South countries and asking them how they feel about this and whether they'll be supportive. This does not sound like the old Cold War narrative that is being espoused by Owen. This is really about a new way of doing it, trying to drive consensus, trying to get countries to understand that there's some pressure from the other countries that this is not something that should go on forever.
Can China be a bridge, China, not only between Russia and Ukraine, but also between, shall we say, the global South and the West over this conflict too?
I don't know that it's a bridge between the West. It's definitely a conduit for feelings about this in the global South, and you've seen that time and time again echoed in the halls of the countries themselves, as opposed to what Washington is trying to tell them to say.
Chris, a brief final word from you then. We touched briefly on this, but the reality on the ground. Do you think that either side has reached the conclusion yet that they can't go much further in terms of absolutely resolving this one through military means on the ground?
That's certainly the impression that I have and that I get. I think that even in Moscow, where you could say arguably their position is stronger, the economy is in good shape, there's good popular support for the Kremlin and for the military, and clearly, they're making progress on the battlefield, even if it's modest. So Russia's position appears to be a lot stronger, but yet we have certainly seen this kind of change in position where they're now definitely indicating that they're more willing to talk and to start a peace process. And the reasons for it, just very briefly, are two factors. One, of course, they feel that they are in a strong position, that they perceive Ukraine's position to be getting tougher. As Owen mentioned, it's harder to get money. The critical factor of military, of course, is running out of people, etc. So they do feel they're in a stronger position.
Right.
At the same time, though, there's a lot more narrative in Moscow about the fact that sanctions accumulation is starting to have an impact. The economy is in great shape today, but in 12 months' time, especially after the financial sanctions, it might be different. So all of those factors have kind of led to the conclusion that it's time to draw a line on this.
All right. It's also time to draw a line on this show, unfortunately, although the discussion has been in great shape. It's been good to have a little bit of different perspective as well. Let's thank all of our guests for joining us, Einar, Chris and Owen. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami, Zeidan, and the whole team here. For now, it's goodbye.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.